to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a very interesting organization that touches our lives every day, and that is the United Nations. And in particular, we're going to focus upon the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Brenden Varma has served as a United Nations spokesperson and political affairs officer for over 20 years in New York, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Mogadishu, and Pristina. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. He has been involved in the United Nations in so many different activities, we could not cover them all today. Brenden, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. That was no exaggeration. When I look at your resume, we could spend 2 hours on each item almost. But anyway, let's get right into it. What is the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C.? What's your main mission, your goal?
Sure. Well, the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. is part of a global network of UN information centers throughout the world. We're managed by the UN Department of Global Communications. And the one here in Washington, we have a mandate to communicate with the people and government of the United States of America, basically trying to inform, educate, update Americans about the work and the values of the UN, with the ultimate aim of building support for our organization.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to your website at www.un.org/Washington to get much more information on what you're about. Well, who are your constituents? With whom do you deal in Washington? I can imagine public policy makers, senators, members of Congress, business people, environmentalists, labor union, just on across the board. Who do you deal with?
All of them, yes,
all of the
exactly,
above.
Bill. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have
Okay.
a broad mandate to talk to a wide cross section of Americans. So we deal with, of course, as you mentioned, folks on Capitol Hill, members of Congress. We deal with the administration. So, for example, the State Department, various other departments of the U.S. government. We also deal with DC-based international financial institutions, the Inter-American System, which is also based in Washington, including the Inter-American Development Bank, Organization of American States, and we deal with the American peoples. That also includes civil society. It includes young people. And it's not just in Washington, D.C. We speak in person or virtually with Americans, including youth, around the whole country, including Ohio, for example, where I just visited with our Undersecretary General for Global Communications. It's definitely important for us to talk to a wide cross-section of Americans.
And you know very well how the UN affects our lives. You've been involved with the UN for well over 20 years, but that raises an interesting point. I've reviewed the polls, the public opinion polls over the past several decades, and even going back from the time the UN was formed in 1945 in San Francisco, California, the polls have shown that, generally speaking, the American public supports the UN anywhere from about 38% to 84%, depending upon the issue. It fluctuates just depending upon what the issue is. But the polls also show that we do not understand the United Nations very well. Do you have an elevator speech, or do you have a comment that you share with people who you go visit with? You say, well, I don't know much about the UN. The UN's a one world government, which it's not. The UN's super rich, which it's not. We all know that's the truth. But do you have a certain message you can get across to them in 30, 40 seconds?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's just tough to boil it all down to 30, 40 seconds, but I speak a little bit longer than that to explain this complex organization. And yes, a lot of people, they often think they know what the UN is, but there's a lot of gaps in knowledge there, and we're always very happy to kind of fill in those gaps. And yes, as you mentioned, people who think that we might be a world government, which of course we're not. We're an organization of 193 sovereign and equal member states. Also, I mean, sometimes people think that we're a very rich organization, and they're always surprised to kind of hear that our yearly budget is actually smaller than the yearly budget for the New York Police Department. They might think that we're a huge global workforce, when actually we have less staff in the UN Secretariat across the world than Disney World has in Orlando, Florida. So we're actually charged with doing a lot of things around the world, a lot of very important things. And we take that work very seriously, but we don't always have the resources that we need to do everything that's asked of us. Of course, we do the best that we can, and we'll continue to do what we can, because it's very important for us that we contribute to the betterment of our societies throughout the world.
Mhm. Yeah, it comes as a surprise as I've talked to people over the years about the UN family, and most people think of the UN as the Secretariat, Security Council, General Assembly, and peacekeeping, and that's about it. But they don't factor in all these other UN agencies that are helping to move aircraft, ships, mail, and weather information around the world. You've got UNICEF and the World Health Organization that teamed up with Rotary International back in around 1987 to develop the largest international health program ever, Polio Plus, to eliminate the scourge of polio. But those are the types of services that people benefit from every day, but we're just not aware of them, are we?
Not always. And there are other ways that the UN touches your lives, which you might not even be aware of. Like, for example, a lot of times when I present to students, a lot of times they're coming not just from the US, but from other countries as well. And when I ask them, in their countries, including in the US, when you are driving and you come to a traffic light, what color means stop? And they will all say, no matter where they're from, they will say red. And why is that? How can it be that 193 countries just happen to have the same understanding of what color means stop? And that's because of a norm that was developed by a conference under the auspices of the UN Economic and Social Council that had to do with road safety and traffic. And so this is just one way in which the UN touches our lives in ways that we don't always know, but in a way that helps us understand each other more as an international community and keeps us safe.
It certainly does. And you have to have somebody, some agency, some institution out there that brings all of these entities together, like with the shipping industry, to develop the rules and regulations to move ships safely on the high seas, or the airline industry to move aircraft safely in international airspace. It just doesn't happen by itself. I often said, just imagine if every country had to strike a bilateral agreement with every other country where their aircraft flew, you'd have so many rules and regulations you couldn't get the pilots into the cockpit. It would be absolutely impossible. And these things just don't happen. And the UN does this for us. So it's a remarkable organization. It certainly has its warts and imperfections. I think we're all in agreement with that. The UN people will tell me that. But anyway, let's, well, before I forget it, let me mention the UN, www.un.org, which has a lot more information about what we're talking about today and the myriad of issues that the UN confronts every day. But let's go back to some of the main issues you're talking about right now. What are you conveying to the people who come to your office or you go to their offices about some of the top issues that we need to be concerned about?
Sure. Well, I think because our office, the UN Information Center in Washington, falls under the Department of Global Communications, we definitely prioritize the areas of communication that are important for our department. And those include promoting climate action, ending the war in Ukraine, fighting inequality. And underpinning all of that is also promoting information integrity, because we're seeing a big surge in disinformation throughout the world. People don't always know what the truth is. So we're trying to see how we can help in that regard as well.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And please feel free to direct people to our globalconnectionstelevision.com website. We're happy to help inform people about the climate change issue, nuclear proliferation, some peacekeeping efforts and what have you is extremely important. Well, recently we saw the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with, I guess, its 6th report and really sounded the alarm bells. And of course, Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been saying this for years now, that we're reaching a critical point. Former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said it all the way going back to Kofi Annan and even beyond him, probably, I guess. But how is this message being received? Are people receptive to it? Are they getting concerned? Because Al Gore said at some point we're going to hit the tipping point where we cannot reverse all of the climatological disasters that are facing us.
Well, the Secretary General has been very clear about the need to promote climate action. And you mentioned our former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and I traveled with him to Antarctica actually when he was the Secretary General, and we went there to show the world that climate change was actually happening. We took journalists with us. We had an outdoor press conference right out there on the ice in Antarctica to show that glaciers were melting, this threat was real, and that we had to come together to fight it. So, I mean, this sort of action is definitely still being promoted. Now we're in a very different place than we were back then in the early 2000s when I went to Antarctica with Ban Ki-moon. Now you have a lot of really inspiring youth activists who have taken up the mantle and who are really clamoring for climate action because they rightfully see it as a threat that needs to be addressed. So that's very heartening, of course. And then from the Washington perspective, when we have visitors come to town from the UN, we definitely make sure to facilitate their interactions with, for example, members of Congress or with the different departments of the government. For example, the Treasury Department that might have a vested interest in knowing more about what the UN is doing in this regard. So, for example, very recently we had the Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, Selwyn Hart, who came to town, who came to Washington. We made sure to support his mission so that he could provide the information that was needed in the corridors of power here in Washington, so that the American government and ultimately the American people would know how the UN can be a good partner in addressing this threat that really does not respect national borders and affects us all.
It certainly doesn't. It's one that we have to move much more quickly on. And the UN has been a leader in this area for decades now, especially through the UN conferences, through reports, through a variety of other arrangements and what have you. And of course, their COP meetings each year, which have been absolutely critical. What do you recommend to people who say, what can we do more quickly? How can we deal with this climate crisis? Where do we go next and get this thing at least maybe not stop, but slow it down or reverse it to some degree?
Sure. Well, there are definitely actions that anyone can take, including in their everyday lives. And one thing that the UN Department of Global Communications has done, it launched a campaign called Act Now. And basically, if you just Google UN and then Act Now as one word, you'll kind of find an app that helps you kind of take action, everyday action to combat climate change. It kind of measures the actions that you're taking. So you can kind of track what you as an individual are doing to help reverse the threats associated with climate change.
Mm-hmm. And we all need to do that. We need to do it immediately, without a doubt. Well, what are there are so many major issues. What's another one that you're dealing with that people are concerned about?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've also seen incidents lately that show that member states are not always respecting the UN Charter, and they're violating the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity of different countries. That's been a big push as well. I mentioned ending the war in Ukraine is another one of our communications priorities, and that's something that's definitely very much on our radar as well.
Mm-hmm. And that I think that war in Ukraine is a total disaster from the word go. But it has shown to us how interdependent the world is and how we are so interlocked in a variety of ways with people in far-flung areas of the world that we wouldn't even think about, especially when it comes to agricultural production or when it comes to committing resources to fight an illegal war or whatever against an illegal invader. So it really has shown that we are in a very interdependent world. And we're getting more interdependent every day, are we not?
Absolutely. And I think, you just mentioned agriculture. And of course, this is all tied to food security. And I think what the Ukraine conflict showed was, how when you interfere with agricultural production in a major breadbasket, in a major food producer like Ukraine, how that can have ramifications in, across the world in places like the Horn of Africa and places like Yemen. So, I mean, I think the Secretary General with his Black Sea Grain Initiative has done a lot to use diplomacy to actually, in a very real way, tackle this food insecurity crisis that we have that's been provoked by the war in Ukraine. With the help of Turkey and with the cooperation of Ukraine and Russia, he's basically helped to make sure that the grain can get out of Ukraine and to the people that need to consume it. Of course, this has helped to bring down food prices, but it's also been able to increase supply of food to organizations like the World Food Program, which is also a part of the UN, which has then been able to get this food to the people who need it most.
Mm-hmm. And that Black Sea Grain Initiative was extremely, extremely important. We'll come back in a minute and talk about Ukraine in just a second, but let me just pause for a moment to say, You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at an institution that touches all 8 billion people on the planet every day in some way, shape, or form, and that's the United Nations. My guest is an expert on the UN. Mr. Brenden Varma has served as a United Nations spokesperson and political affairs officer for over 20 years in New York. He is currently the deputy director of the UN Information Center in Washington. Brenden, you brought up Ukraine, and that raises an interesting point that I brought up a couple of times on the program. Here we could spend hours on it, but for so long, I've heard so many of these talking heads out here on TV, conservatives for sure, liberals every now and then, criticize the UN because the UN Security Council was paralyzed because of the way it's set up. You can't change the rules in mid-game. Russia has a veto, but the UN Security Council still has done some substantive things to help resolve this problem in Ukraine. But even on the other hand, you've got the UN General Assembly that has been very active in drafting resolutions to bring a conclusion or a peaceful conclusion. And you've got the whole litany of UN agencies, the World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, World Health Organization, the Refugees Program of the UN on the ground in Ukraine every day, helping to save people's lives. Do you not?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. There are UN humanitarian agencies that are heavily involved in helping the Ukrainian people, and they will continue to do so. We also have our UN human rights colleagues as well, who are on the ground monitoring the situation as well.
That is extremely important. And that's what we need to keep in mind. We have to look at it objectively and see exactly what is happening and who's providing assistance and what more can be done. Well, Brenden, you've been involved with the United Nations for several years. You have one of the most unique experiences. You served as a spokesperson for the President of the General Assembly, not once, but twice. I'm sure maybe there are some other people who've done that, but I don't know any of them. But all of them I've known have just been one-termers. But talk a little bit about that. First off, who's the President of the General Assembly, and why is that position so important? And why is the GA's position so important?
Sure. Well, I think it's kind of connected to what you said earlier, Bill, about people not always understanding how the UN is structured and how they might be very focused on the Secretary General and the Secretariat, which is, of course, just one of the 6 organs of the UN. Now, the General Assembly, that's the most democratic body of the UN. All 193 member states sit there and they're all equal. They all get one equal vote, no matter how big, no matter how small. So it's a very special body of the UN. And so the president of the General Assembly, who's elected to a one-year term, presides over that incredible body. And so the president has a very unique role, a convening role, a role in which he or she can bring people together to talk about the issues that affect all 193 countries. And so that's why it's an incredible role. And you know, within the UN system, it's the member states that determine the vision for what the Secretariat will do. They are our bosses. They tell us what to do, and then we do it. So that body where these kind of decisions get made is absolutely key to the UN.
You had mentioned earlier that you accompanied Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, to Antarctica, which was really a remarkable expedition. It really was. It was gripping. It was informative. It was so educational and really focused on the problem of climate change. But as you think back over your years serving as spokesperson, I'm sure you have many fond memories. Is there one memory or one event that comes to mind more often than others?
Would be pretty hard to top Antarctica, I think. On
I
that
would say so.
on that same trip, I mean, we also went to the Amazon in Brazil, and I mean, I think that just on that trip, it was very, of course, environmentally focused. It was important for the Secretary General to kind of see the effects that climate change was having on all different types of environments throughout the world. And so, I mean, just in that one trip, I mean, it was incredible to see the diversity of our planet, the rich biodiversity that our world has, and just to be reminded of the importance in of preserving it.
Mhm. And we've mentioned earlier about the United Nations dealing with so many issues, from human trafficking to climate change to nuclear proliferation, just on across the board. There are 17 sustainable development goals that were adopted in 2015, I guess it was, yes, by the General Assembly, and came online in 2016 to run over 15 years. And they're very laudable goals, 17 goals, one to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women, to combat climate change, and to do many other great things that most people are totally in agreement with. And a large number of private sector businesses, other groups, public entities are on board supporting these. When you encounter folks, do you see that so many people have never heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? And how do you explain to them what they are and why we should learn more about them and to help support them?
Yes, there are definitely times when I encounter people who have not heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. But I'm also surprised by the amount of people who have, and that's always very encouraging. And what I always stress is that these 17 goals were agreed to by all 193 member states of the UN, and that's something that's very special. Sometimes people say that the Security Council is more powerful because it has binding resolutions, and that the General Assembly's resolutions are not as powerful because they're not binding. So why would people want to even implement them? But the fact that you had 193 member states being able to agree on 17 goals, to kind of agree on an agenda on how to make our world a better place by the year 2030, that really carries a lot of political weight. The fact that these countries have also agreed to voluntarily report on their progress towards meeting these goals, that also carries a lot of political weight. It's not just symbolic, it's just showing incredible commitment towards working together to make our world a better place. And usually when I talk to groups of students, for example, I say, even just within this group, it would probably be hard to kind of agree on what kind of pizza we would want to order if we were going to order dinner tonight. But to get 193 different governments to agree on the blueprint forward to a better world by 2030, that is not easy. And so it's very special that was done. And so I mean that's something that I always stress, that you have already the buy-in, you already have the agreement on how the blueprint should look like. So now it's just time to implement it. And I can tell you that right now we are not on track to meet the SDGs by 2030. Our top officials have said this many times. For that, we need a lot more commitment from not just governments, but civil society, the private sector, young people. And so, I mean, we will keep sounding the bullhorn. We will keep trying to get people to understand that these goals exist and to work with them to meet them.
Exactly, which is what we definitely have to do. Well, Brenden, you've been involved with the UN. You've had a successful career at the United Nations for well over 20 years. And I'm just curious, in looking back from the time you came in to up to date now, what changes have you seen that the UN has adopted to improve the organization to make it more effective? And is there something there the UN should do that it hasn't done that would be helpful to make it more effective in the future?
Well, the UN has been evolving since it was created, and it will continue to evolve. So I can't really predict in the direction it might go in the future, but I can tell you, for example, UN peacekeeping is something it's not in our UN charter. It was not envisioned necessarily by our founders, but it has become such a central part of UN work. And it kind of arose because member states felt the need to develop it. So, I mean, that's just one example of how the UN has already reformed, how it has already evolved. And I have no doubt that reforms and evolution will continue in the future. One thing that I've noticed personally during my 20-year tenure at the UN has been the focus on gender equality and gender parity, which we didn't hear that much about when I first started 20 years ago. And that kind of comes down into even the way that we do our own work as members of the Secretariat. For example, our Secretary General has really pushed for gender parity. So now you see at the highest levels of the UN, when you look at our senior most officials, we have perfect gender parity. We have gender balance there. So it's not like we have more male leaders than female leaders. No, we have gender parity there, which is something that I think is definitely worth feeling proud about. Also, in the past, we would travel, on delegations to different missions. And I definitely see photos of myself in delegations that were all male. That really wouldn't happen anymore. We would go kind of in more mixed delegations to show, first of all, the diversity of our workforce, but also to make sure that we're being sensitive to concerns. For example, when you show up in a country with a mixed delegation in terms of gender, but also ethnicity, nationality, race, that's inspiring to people. It shows that we are a global community, we are a global workforce, we are diverse, and in that diversity is a lot of strength.
Mm-hmm. And you're right, the UN of today is certainly not the UN that was created in post-World War II in 1945. Its mission has expanded, it's doing so much more today because we wanted to. Somebody has to deal with polio, somebody has to deal with peacekeeping, you mentioned, which was not even included in the UN Charter. Somebody has to deal with climate change. And the UN is still, even though it has shortcomings, no doubt about that, but it's still the only game in town. It brings all the countries of the world together, basically, to focus on these problems and to do them collectively, because no country can defeat climate change. No region can defeat human trafficking by itself. You have to do it together. And it's in our best interest, and it's a bargain for the United States. The U.S. probably gains more from the UN than maybe any other country that participates. We could argue that someday at a later date or something. But the point is, it is in everybody's best interest, and we need to make it a more effective and more efficient organization. But Brenden Varma, I want to thank you so very much for being with me today and for a very interesting and informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.